Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, friends. Ryan here with another episode of Sound Check. Today, we're talking about load boxes, specifically my new toy, the Suhr Reactive Load, which is tentatively going to replace the 2-Notes Torpedo Captor, the 8-ohm flavor to be exact, that I've been using for the past almost couple years at this point, and to much satisfaction at that. I really like the sound of this load box. It's helped me make all kinds of demos, covers. It's allowed me to record 50 to 100 watt tube amplifiers at levels that are either reasonable or completely silent as far as my neighbors are concerned. So you might be wondering, why am I talking about replacing this thing? Well, I'll spare you most of the technical details since this is indeed one of the least scientific series that I make. But to put it simply, not all load boxes are created equally. Hell, not even all the ones that advertise themselves as being reactive are created equally. And even if they were designed perfectly, and none of these are, that would be okay, because the parts of the amplifier circuit that these are trying to replace aren't created equally either. So a speaker does an interesting thing in a guitar amp, or at least a tube guitar amp circuit. And this is a phenomenon that if you want more information on, you can go watch a previous video I made. It's an explained episode on reactive load boxes, and I even go into more depth on the difference between resistive and reactive load boxes on the Mesa Boogie Cab Clone Gen 1 review, so I'll have those linked somewhere. Either way, this guy is trying to trick a tube amplifier power section into thinking that it's plugged into a speaker, because if it's not plugged into a speaker, things go boom, and we don't want that. You see, unlike most solid-state power sections, tube power amps are expecting some kind of load on its circuit, and generally in the 8, 4, or 16 ohm flavors. You might have different speaker jacks for that, or you might have a switch that you can change on the back of your amplifier, but it has to have some destination for all that voltage and current to go. You'll notice, though, on a lot of solid-state amps, that it'll say something like 2 ohms minimum for this amount of power output. And it's still not good for a lot of those amps to run without any speaker load whatsoever, but it can definitely tolerate it a lot better than a tube amplifier. So that's where these guys come in, because for most of us, if you're living in a place like I am, you just cannot turn a tube amp up loud enough to get it to its sweet spot, to start getting that magical power tube breakup if you're going after that kind of sound, or even just to get it to sound good at all, especially if you want to mic up a cabinet. You can't have it low level enough to not wake the neighbors with the levels still being good going to your recording solution. So instead, you can hook your guitar amp up to one of these, bypass the speaker entirely. This satisfies the tube amplifier, and you send one of these DI lines into your audio recording interface. Ta-da, you now have a completed signal chain. Now, the electronically savvy among you might be thinking, well, if this amp wants 8 ohms, why can't we just give it an 8 ohm resistor with, say, 100 watts of power capacity and wire up a DI, plug it into your interface? Ta-da! The amp is satisfied, right? It's probably going to be a lot cheaper than this, and you'd be right on both accounts. The problem is, it sounds like garbage, and a lot of plain load boxes that don't advertise themselves as being reactive, and even attenuators on top of that, basically are that. But as you might have heard in that aforementioned cab clone video, a resistive load just sounds flat, dull, no dynamics, no life, none of the things that we associate with tube amplifiers. And the reason that is because speakers aren't perfectly resistive loads. Their impedance, or the AC equivalent of resistance, changes per frequency. In fact, the impedance curve of most Celestion style speakers looks something like this, where you get a big low end bump anywhere between, say, 80 to 120 hertz, kind of scoops back out in the 300-400 hertz region before it starts to climb up again in the high frequencies. Without this reactivity, your tube head goes from this thunderous wall of sound to kind of like a 90s distortion pedal. It's not pleasant. So in order to achieve the best that your amplifier can at bedroom volumes or for silent recording applications, you basically have to have one of these things. That finally brings us to why I have this in my possession now. As I said earlier, not all reactive loads are created equally. And that's because of the methods they choose to try to model this reactivity curve, this impedance curve that we see in a lot of the speaker models. A lot of them get close, And some of them don't even get that close mathematically and still sound pretty close to the speakers that they're sort of going after, while others, well, they go the whole 9 yards and sound that much better because of it. Now, to be completely clear, I don't dislike this load box. I still love it. And in fact, with a few EQ tweaks, I can make this sound almost identical, sit in the mix pretty much the same as a real speaker cabinet, specifically my V30 equipped oversized Mesa, because I'm pretty sure 2 Notes is trying to kind of model a V30, or at least go for a middle of the road Celestion sound that plays nice with all their cab modeling. Whereas according to some non-official sources, the Suhr Reactive Load is trying to nail a greenbacks impedance. And I think they did quite a nice job on it, and if I do say so myself, a better job than 2 Notes did with their reactive load. But before we go any further, I'll let you be the judge. All the high gain demonstrations you're about to hear were recorded with the same signal chains, at least between each test. That means same guitar track, same guitar amp settings, in fact the same impulse response used, but with one variable, the reactive load. I'm running a line out from the amp head, which means we're getting the full power amp signal, just in an attenuated volume so it doesn't blow up any of my equipment. And we'll be testing 3 different loads. Of course, the new Suhr Reactive Load, the 2 Notes captor that I've been using, and the real speaker cab that I use most of the time, my aforementioned oversized Mesa. I was going to put a greenback equipped cabinet here until I realized that I'd swapped out one of the greens for a creamback, and that's going to throw off the impedance. And I kind of forgot about that until I was doing tests, so my bad. No direct demonstrations to compare this with a greenback, but doesn't really matter because my conclusion's basically the same. You'd be hard pressed to call any of that bad necessarily, but I definitely have my personal winner, and it's the Suhr Reactive Load by far, which is crazy because up to this point, I always preferred the real speaker cabinet. You know, there's that little bit of difference, but I could tell if you A/B test them. And this isn't a fair comparison. You know, it's not apples to apples because this is going after a different speaker sound. But even then, with the kind of IRs I use, the sound I'm going for, this just has a brutally hard, glassy sound to it. It makes the tube amp sound more tubey. I know that sounds ridiculous, but compared to the real speaker, at least the V30 and especially the captor, this thing just sounds loose and all over the place. This has so much focus, but it still, you know, doesn't detract from the mid response or anything like that. That low end whoosh, and there's like a sharp transient that just sucker punches you in the face. I'm in love with this sound. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily make this a bad sound, and I would definitely say you have to do less work with this in terms of mixing than you do with this. But even then, after some very minor low pass, high pass, you know, pick out a couple problem frequencies, I think the end result is still better with this, at least for contemporary high gain tones, which is what I'm going after 99% of the time. It's all going to come down to personal preference, of course, but I think it's safe to say I've found my permanent recording solution for the next few years to come, unless something drastically changes in the load box market. Speaking of which, a quick word on that and why I ultimately went with this, because there's certainly some downsides and, you know, some added expense to going with a Suhr product in general. The first thing you might be asking yourself is, you know, why didn't you get something with impulse response loading? Because there's a Suhr IR, there's a new, you know, Torpedo Captor X, which has all kinds of goodies compared to even the Suhr IR with, like, you know, stereo stuff and like a stereo expander, onboard effects, that kind of thing. And that might be great if you play tube amplifiers live and you need something to go to front of house and tame your volume, all that. Probably a great solution, and whatever inaccuracies that the load box presents aren't going to be all that important live anyway. But for me, that's kind of pointless and wasted money, because the entire point of using one of these over a real speaker cab besides volume is that I can always change the IR later in the DAW. So I wouldn't ever use that. I just want a raw signal. So all that stuff's irrelevant to me. In a perfect world, I would have gone with one of two options. Number one, Fractal Audio's LB2. It has a rocker switch to go between a US and UK voicing in terms of the impedance response. A couple problems with that. Number one, it's like huge. Number two, they're never in stock and you can never find them used. So bye-bye, which is a bit of a shame because they're, you know, at $300. The value's better, but I also never use US voice speakers, so it would probably live in that one setting. The product I would really like to see and would make me consider upgrading, quote unquote, from the Suhr Reactive Load would be a pared down version of the Waza tube expander, which, you know, has all kinds of cool features, but I pretty much already have bits and pieces of that machine, or I, you know, fill that in with plugins or an external power amp, whatever. What I really love about that is there's 4 different reactivity switches for the low frequency and the high frequency. So you could have, you know, 16 combinations total. If they made a box this size, hell, twice this size with just that, I would buy it, because that would pretty much be the end all, you know, recording solution for any impedance curve you could get close enough, I think. However, that doesn't exist. I like the sound of this, and it has its own character. I'm really pumped. So it's a little more money than I would like to spend on something that, you know, it's not exactly a glorious piece of gear, but it is so important, and you can hear the results. So yeah, Suhr Reactive Load for me for the next little while. I'll probably hang on to this for a bit. I'm going to run a few more experiments, and, you know, I'll probably take advantage of the attenuation a few more times, but expect to see this on my reverb shop sooner rather than later. Any other questions and comments, please leave them down below. Take them as always. Thank you so very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.